yeah, this is a good question, and perhaps at first pass, I would say yes. It would seem surprising, especially coming from a Western perspective with our, Frankenstein complex, the fear of mechanical men, which was the term that Isaac Asimov coined. So perhaps in light of relative recent parts of history, it may seem surprising. But if we go a little further back in history, we actually find the precursors to our modern day robots, these so-called automatons. So they were clockwork type robots that work via cogs and springs and tension release. So like the mechanical knight that Leonardo da Vinci made. And they were actually assigned key roles in church decoration and in worship and sacred theater in medieval times. So essentially we have these precursors in the automatons. They were essentially art installation, we might say, but they conferred something of the divine, so they could replay certain sets of motion, and in this way they could retell some parts of the passion narrative of Jesus, for example. So they served multiple roles of both instructing congregants as well as incite devotion and prayer and worship. So maybe on this historical background, you could actually say that robots are making a comeback to religion, I'd say. But also some might say, oh, this is not a fair way to compare it. Modern day robots, they were able to do many other things that automatons did. And robots such as the sanctified theomorphic operator, I think it's called, that a group of researchers recently has created it, made it for a Catholic prayer practice. It can actually communicate and respond to touch and verbal cues, for instance. And so this makes them very social and seemingly intelligent. And this, of course, ties with the discussion of whether robots really are intelligent or conscious, or if they can even come alive in a sense. And then that's only a small step into the whole religious playing God discussion of whether humans could rightfully be creators and masters of life, whether we should. So on this more normative trajectory, there's been a lot of caution from religious groups, maybe sometimes flat out resistance to the idea of robots. And so at least in Western and Middle Eastern religious environments, where we have the Abrahamic religions being dominant. And the reason for this is that these religions share an idea of aniconism, or the prohibition of images, or the prohibition of representing the divine in icons. And in Islam, for example, this has historically been more pronounced than in Christianity. But if you conceive of robots and market them as representing the divine, as something some designers and roboticists do, we should expect to see some clash with religion here. But so far, at least to my knowledge, there's not been a lot of conflict here yet. But I think also just in closing this part of the question, I think it's also important to mention that in other religious traditions, in Eastern Asia, for instance, especially in Japanese Buddhism, there's been way more acceptance of robots. They do not suffer from Western nature culture dualism, and they have a more animistic tradition where things made of human hands, they can very well be animated. So artifacts and shrines can be spiritually imbued more naturally, you might say. So they don't have the same dichotomy. So yeah, I think at least it's not surprising that the world's first robotic deity, Minda, the robot, was introduced in a Buddhist temple in Kyoto. So yeah, I think a little surprising maybe, but if you look further into history, not too surprising. I think our main aim, at least, is to bring roboticists and designers together with theologians and scholars of religion. So bring them to the same table to discuss robots and automation in religious practice. I think it's highly appropriate that creators of these theomorphic robots now and especially in the future join forces with scholars in religion. And I feel there's a great readiness actually to come together in forums such as this workshop and discuss these things. And also I think if we aim for robots in religion to become culturally sustainable, as is a key term for the conference, Robot Philosophy Conference, we need to begin to identify the values and theological aims of the relevant religious traditions, so that robots may be developed in compliance and in service and in respect of those. And I think that's also a main aim that we should try to achieve at this workshop. And also if we could maybe work out or sketch avenues for future research that will be of mutual interest, I think that'd be great. This is again a good question, and I think there's way too many exciting questions that I probably cannot get to in this short interview. But I think one of the questions heading into the conference that I would be looking out for is maybe an overarching question of automation of spiritual practice. Think of robots that assist in church service, assist practitioners and believers as they pray or meditate. Robots that would remind, instruct, or nudge believers to do certain things. And I think if we could back up a little bit, as robots are introduced in religion, I think it's appropriate to ask what it is even to be religious. Is it something we believe or something we do? Or is religiosity a lived practice, or is it a belief system? So a certain set of propositions about the world that we believe. And I think this makes a difference when we talk about automation and robotics in religion. So what I'm wondering is if being religious means performing certain rituals or a set of practice, how does automation, robotics fit into this picture? Will robotics as tools of automation be a medium through which religious people perform their religiosity? So will robotics in religion actually begin to shape the way people do religion? And perversely, so what will this mean for the design of robots? Will we need religious authorities to weigh in on the design and programming of robots, for instance? But while we think about these questions, I suspect we will also see a conservative trend arise in most denominations to criticize this development. I expect, and I only have anecdotal evidence for this, but that a critique from this perspective will focus on religiosity as being about inner convictions of the believer, and put less emphasis on outward practices that are open to automation. So we might suspect some resistance to come here from this angle, and I think that's a great question to begin to ask in this sort of interdisciplinary setting. And another question I might also quickly mention is the question of actually representing the divine in technology. So in philosophy as a broader context, we've been discussing how we should review robots that represent humans. So should we perceive them and treat them as some sort of quasi-persons? So the whole Sophia controversy: should robots have rights? Are they mortal patients, etc.? And this development in making robots that represent deities potentially has a lot of parallel questions, but also a lot of new ones that we are still to discover. And I think that's going to be a very interesting question to discuss here at our workshop. So yeah, we've invited scholars both from Christianity and Islamic and Buddhist tradition. I think it's going to be very exciting to discuss how this plays out in different religious domains.